Good evening. I'm Dr. Jeff Moorhouse, Superintendent of Kingsport City Schools, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this special online family engagement event where this evening we are fortunate to be joined by Dr. Buddy Creech from Vanderbilt University to learn more about the medical research and information related to COVID vaccines. As the body of knowledge has continued to grow regarding COVID and that it appears that we are on the verge of vaccines being made available to younger children, we wanted to provide our families with information so that they can be fully informed, and we are excited to have someone of the caliber of Dr. Creech to provide us this information. As we started the discussion tonight, we wanted to make sure that you knew about Dr. Creech's background and credentials. Dr. Creech is an Associate Professor of Pediatrics in the Division of Pediatrics Infectious Diseases at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. He serves as the Director of the Vanderbilt Vaccine Research Program and Principal Investigator of the Vanderbilt Vaccine and Treatment Evaluation Unit. He is also the Co-Principal Investigator of the Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Network. Dr. Creech's research focuses on the development and evaluation of new vaccines and therapeutics. He is currently leading COVID-related vaccine clinical trials at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, including the evaluation of novel treatment options for hospitalized patients with COVID and trials of candidate SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. Dr. Creech holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology, cum laude from Vanderbilt University, prior to graduating with high honors from the University of Tennessee College of Medicine in Memphis. He completed pediatric training at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, serving as chief resident in 2002. He is also holding a master's degree in public health. He is active in the Infectious Disease Society of America and the Pediatric Infectious Diseases Society, where he serves as president-elect. Dr. Creech, we are so pleased to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Maybe one of the most important things I'll say is I'm a native Tennessean. I have lived in Tennessee all my life. My mom is from Sevier County. My dad's from Knoxville. I grew up in Chattanooga. My wife is from Memphis. So this is home. It always will be. And I'm just delighted to be a part of this tonight. I'm going to share my screen, and what I'm going to do with that is, what I hope to do at least, is share a little bit about where we are and where we think we're going as it relates to COVID. And this is an exciting time for us because we're starting to see some changes with kids that are going to be vaccinated soon. We certainly are seeing the benefits of immunity throughout the country. And so what I hope to be able to do is maybe do a little bit of level setting here at the beginning, just to share a little bit about what we think is important right now, and then move very quickly into your questions, because I think that's where maybe we can have the best dialogue, is rather than just hearing me talk, we can just think together about this, knowing that we all kind of want the best thing for our kids, for our families, and for our own selves. So let's start with just talking a little bit about coronavirus. This is our target right here. We hate this thing right now. This virus is covered in these red proteins that are called spike proteins. And that's one of the reasons why we call it coronavirus, is because it makes it look like a crown. And we've known for about 30 years, maybe 25 to 30 years, that if we can make an immune response to that red spike protein, that's what will prevent us from having severe disease from either coronaviruses in general, or to these epidemic strains that come across our plates every now and again. You know, the first time we saw this was when I was in training, fresh out of medical school. We saw the original SARS, and it really never took root. And then over the past decade and a half or so, we've been really tracking these outbreaks in the Middle East of a Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. But no matter the virus type, they're all characterized by these red spike proteins that then interact with these blue proteins on our host membranes. And so this is the human ACE2 receptor. These are throughout the body, but in particular, they're in the nose, they're in the lungs, they're in the lining of the muscle fibers of the heart, they're in our blood vessels, and they're in our intestines. And in fact, if you look at where they are most plentiful, it's actually in the gut. And this might be one of the reasons that when we see kids get infected with COVID, they often have a lot of abdominal pain, more so than the pneumonia that we see in adults. And that might have to do with the fact that this blue receptor that locks on to this spike protein of coronavirus, it's not as plentiful in the noses of young kids, but it's really plentiful in the guts and sometimes in the heart and in the blood vessels. What we're trying to do with vaccines is block this interaction before it ever starts. Because if we can keep coronavirus from docking with our cells, then we have the ability then to kill this virus before it can start multiplying in our bodies. Now, we've tried to do that with three primary strategies so far. And I'm going to go left to right in terms of not how they were developed, but kind of how we conceptualized this at the very beginning. So the first option that we had before us was to make this like any other vaccine. Pick a laboratory up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, find a lot of the virus, grow a lot of it, and then purify out this red protein. That's what we do for flu, right? We get a bunch of chicken eggs, we inject flu virus into it, we grow a bunch of the virus, and then we purify out just one of the proteins. Now that works, and certainly we have good vaccines that are based off of that. But the challenge is sometimes the protein isn't folded or shaped the right way. Or sometimes there are other things that we have to do to purify that protein that get added into the vaccine, or that change some of the little sugar spots that are on top of this protein. But that's the approach that Novavax has done. And you've heard this manufacturer, their vaccine's not ready for use yet, but like the other vaccines that have been evaluated, it works. It makes a good immune response. It appears to be safe. It uses a novel stimulator of the immune system that comes from the Chilean soap bark tree. And that's something that's from Chile, but we also have it in other places, including California in the US. And it's a good stimulant of the immune system. We haven't used it in a vaccine before, but it appears to be safe and effective. We're still learning about how to best use that. The second one in the middle is a viral vectored vaccine. You basically take one virus and then you put the DNA or the genetic material of another virus inside of it. It's kind of like the turducken of the vaccine world, because what we're trying to do is protect that genetic payload, in this case with a virus that's outside of it. Now that virus on the outside, it's been rendered inert. It can't replicate. It can't really do anything to you. All it can do is stick to your cells, get taken up, and then deliver that payload. And in this case, it's delivering the payload of the genetic sequence of that spike protein from coronavirus. And this is what AstraZeneca did in the European Union. That's where it's been most commonly used and around the world. And what Johnson & Johnson did with their European subsidiary called Janssen. I know that I just said Johnson & Johnson and Janssen. It sounds Looney Tunes, and I agree. And then the third one is the newest kid on the block. These are mRNA-based vaccines. Like the viral vectored vaccines, we've known about these and we've been working on these for the better part of 2 or 3 decades. The mRNA-based activities, though, were really focused on gene therapy. So if you had someone with sickle cell or cystic fibrosis or some other genetic disease that just needed someone to add some more, that protein to your body. Well, people have been trying to do that with mRNA-based technologies. And oftentimes you can't give enough of it to actually work. But when we think about it being used to deliver just a little bit of that genetic sequence for the spike protein, we turn the protein manufacturing plant of this vaccine from Kalamazoo, Michigan, like it is on the left with those protein vaccines, to the deltoid muscle of your arm. And what that means is that when you make the protein, it's shaped the way it's supposed to be shaped. We're just mimicking what the virus does in your body as it relates to just that one protein. It's nice because it's not a live virus. It's not able to make you sick. Although for those of you who have been vaccinated with this, it can really pack a punch. A lot of people are tired and achy and sometimes have fever on the day after vaccine. So these are the 3 that we've got. We've got protein units that aren't yet ready for distribution, haven't been approved yet. We've got the viral vectored vaccine in the United States. That's the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, a virus inside of another virus. And then you've got the mRNA-based vaccines. These are probably the most trimmed down versions. It's just the genetic recipe surrounded by a fat bubble so that your deltoid muscle does all the work. With that being the background, I can tell you that at this point, we've done a pretty good job of getting people vaccinated in the United States. At least 215 million people have gotten one or both doses of the vaccine in the United States. And that's more than 185 million people who have been fully vaccinated. But it's not because we don't have enough. We've got like 500 million doses. It's that in many parts of the country, there's been decreased excitement or acceptance of these vaccines. When we look at it across the world, there are some countries that are doing very, very well in vaccinating. There's some that are doing less well than others. Some are using their own homegrown vaccines like Russia and China. Some are using those that are with Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Pfizer. And that's really the European Union, Canada and the United States, and then Australia. I think what's really interesting in this map is that Africa has not been as heavily vaccinated, in part because of extreme poverty in many of these areas, in part because these vaccines have to be cold, and in part because they have not, it seems, had as much in the way of COVID outbreaks and severe disease as we have. And we don't quite understand why that is just yet. If we look at vaccines in the United States in particular, I think you can appreciate that there are some places that are doing better than others in terms of getting the population vaccinated. The Northeast is more densely vaccinated than, say, the Southeast or the Midwest. California and the Pacific Northwest, they're also a little bit more vaccinated than the rest of us. The reason I think that's so important is from this figure that shows the pandemic starting in February. Now, I have to tell you, my wife and kids and I all got sick in March of 2020 with the initial cluster of infections that was happening here in Nashville. And remember, the thing back then was we were trying to flatten the curve. We did a lot of things to try to flatten that thing, and it worked. We kept our hospitals from being overwhelmed. But we were seeing pockets creep up in different places. South Florida got really hit in July. And we'd see these communities that would get brighter on this map, and it showed that there was increasing disease. But it really wasn't until October and going into December that Michigan, the upper Midwest, then the Midwest, and then really the entire country over the end of the calendar year just lit up. And then what happened? Well, starting in December and January, we began to vaccinate, and we began to experience the immunity that came from having a disease. And we saw it quiet down, except for some spots in New York and in Michigan, a couple of places here and there in Texas. And then I think what really changed was the Delta variant, which really came on board in Missouri and in Louisiana in June and then July. Once Delta took over, it sought out people that were not immune. And what we saw in August going into September was an incredible brightness of activity in the Northeast, in the Northwest. And what you can see, this is now at the end of September, that there was a great deal of disease throughout. This is where we were last Friday, is when I took this snapshot that gives a bit of information. The darker the square or the county, the more disease there is. And I think what you can appreciate is that the Intermountain West and the upper Midwest are being more heavily affected right now. Pennsylvania and West Virginia are being hit. But by and large, in Tennessee and in the Southeast, we've had our wave. And at least when we look at Tennessee, it appears that we had this large wave at the end of 2020. It's gone down. Now we've had this big surge in July, August, and September, and now it's going back down. And I think because of that, we've been able to relax some of the risk mitigation efforts that we've been trying to do, like distancing and masking. In these areas, our daughter's school just went to masks optional. And that was, I think, a reflection of the fact that disease rates are lower right now than they have been. What that means is that hospitalizations go down and deaths go down. And again, this is maybe a chance for me to say one thing that I've heard a lot during the pandemic. We've really struggled with how to understand what happens when there are a lot of cases. And I'm going to tell you something that I think is right. It's okay if we have cases of coronavirus. It's okay if we have cases of SARS-CoV-2. We fully anticipate that this will become our fifth circulating coronavirus for as long as we can predict. The challenge is that when we have so many hospitalizations or deaths as a result of it that could be potentially prevented, that's really where we get into trouble. And it's not just for those who are vaccinated or not. It's an issue of, we were turning away people for elective surgeries. We were closing trauma bays because we simply couldn't take care of that number of patients. That's where it gets really tricky. If I were to have appendicitis or my gallbladder were to just light up, I'd like to be able to go to my hospital and get it taken care of. But there was a stretch there where we simply had no rooms. We were Bethlehem on December 24th. So we really want to be careful to look at these surges and respond in some way to them, whether that's encouraging one another to be vaccinated or taking some of these risk mitigation efforts and doing them during periods where there's a lot of activity. I'm not sure. But I know that these surges are very difficult for the healthcare systems when they happen. In Tennessee, we've got about half of our folks have at least one dose. If we look at those that are 65 and up, which are the most likely to be affected by this virus, upwards of 90% have had at least one dose. Now, which ones are available? Well, we've got a biologics license application that's been approved for Pfizer for those that are 16 years of age and above. An EUA has been granted for Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, and then for boosters. And the only difference there is that Pfizer only has an EUA for 12 to 15. And then we anticipate FDA granting an emergency use authorization for Pfizer for the 5 to 11-year-olds probably by the end of the week. And then the CDC board of directors or advisors will meet next week and probably make the recommendation to administer it. And then Moderna teenagers is lagging a little bit behind. Now, conflict of interest, I don't receive money from any of these groups. I do research with the National Institutes of Health that is overseeing the clinical trials of many of these. So our team has been working for the last year and a half on the Moderna vaccine and on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So I want to make sure that everybody's aware of that. I and a colleague down at Emory named Evan Anderson, we are the national co-principal investigators for the Moderna pediatric studies, where we're going down to 6 months of age. And then we've been doing some other work with the NIH for Moderna vaccines that might not be the original strain, but covering different strains like the one that came up out of South Africa. So I want to make sure that we say that. And then we received some funding at Vanderbilt from Dolly Parton that went to some of the development of assays and tests in the laboratory for Moderna. So I guess I just want to say that because for those of us who work in clinical trials, we're always engaged with companies. And most of us like to do it in a way that isn't paid for by the manufacturer, but paid for through government entities. And that's indeed what we've been doing. All right, so some of the typical questions that I get that I thought I would start with before we move into your direct questions relate to treatment. They relate to vaccine boosters now, to pediatric vaccines, and then to the variants that are popping up. So I thought I would go through those pretty rapid fire. And then again, let's just talk about your questions. So let's start with monoclonal antibodies. What are these? Well, several manufacturers have made these synthetic antibodies that are based off the antibodies that are made following infection. I told you that our family was sick after going to a school fundraiser, and there were 200 of us there, about 40 of us got sick. My youngest daughter was the last to get sick. She really had abdominal pain and some fever, a rash, but didn't have any cough or respiratory symptoms. My son and daughter, who were both, they were junior in high school and a sophomore in college, they felt bad for a couple of days. They had fever, headache, but again, they weren't that sick. My wife had a flu-like illness for about 5 or 6 days, lost her sense of taste and smell. And then I was sick for 16 days, had fever and shortness of breath, had a viral pneumonia, didn't have to go to the hospital, maybe could have, but we had very different diseases. We also had very different antibody responses. And when our colleagues at Vanderbilt wanted to get blood from our group, I have to admit, it was my blood they wanted because they knew my antibodies were going to be of a higher amount and probably of a better quality than those who had less severe disease. So that's one take-home point I would make sure that you hear tonight, is that not all infections are created equally. And those who have very mild disease, quite frankly, don't make very many antibodies and should not assume that they're protected for more than a few months after that event. And in fact, even with infection, my oldest daughter, she had infection with us. She got 2 doses of Pfizer because she was working in a counseling center over the summer. And then she rode in the car with someone who was also vaccinated, but was pre-symptomatic with COVID. She got sick the next day. Well, my daughter got sick about 2.5 days later and felt worse than she did the very first time she had COVID. So it shows you that building immunity to this thing is very challenging indeed. So the way we do this is somebody like me would give blood to a scientist. They would identify the antibodies that are circulating in my bloodstream. They would pick the ones that are super awesome, and then they would find the genetic sequence of that antibody. And then they put that into Chinese hamster ovary cells in order to grow a bunch of this antibody, make a bunch of this antibody that then gets infused through an IV, or sometimes they put them under the skin. It has to be given early after onset of infection to be beneficial, and it's not a replacement for vaccination. I think that's an important piece. These only work for about 2 or 3 months before they begin to wane. What about antiviral medications? Early in the pandemic, I was consenting individuals into clinical trials from my back porch while coughing as I was recovering from COVID. But it was interesting to be talking to patients who were in the throes of COVID themselves. And we were giving them the opportunity to potentially receive this remdesivir medicine that's now approved for use. And it's only got modest benefit, but it does have benefit for those who receive it. Steroids are certainly helpful in that regard too. There is a new drug called molnupiravir. It's oral only, it's not yet approved, but the data look interesting. It apparently has about a 50% reduction in hospitalization and death due to COVID. And the initial safety data are encouraging, but we may not have enough of it at the beginning. And so it may be something that's used preferentially for those who are at highest risk of bad disease. And it won't yet be something like Tamiflu that we could take the moment we feel sick. Again, it would not be a replacement for vaccination. What about variants? This Delta variant really rules the roost right now, but new variants continue to emerge. And in fact, we're watching one in the UK very carefully because they had their peak. They started to come down, but they didn't quite get as down as we did. And now they're clicking back up again, in part because of this Delta plus. We're trying to be creative with our names, and it's kind of annoying. I didn't think I'd have to learn the Greek alphabet to do infectious diseases, but it's probably better than naming them after people like we do for hurricanes. I don't think anybody wants the buddy variant of COVID. There's this Mu variant that's been in the news. It has not died out, but it's still limited to South America. We're going to have a bunch of these. These are going to come and go. I think it's important to recognize that vaccination is going to limit the spread of these variants. It doesn't fuel them. These are not being fueled because we're making it harder for it to land. It's the natural change that's occurring in this virus. And we're always checking for it. We don't tell patients if they have Delta. Right now, you can assume that if you're infected, that's what you've got. But we are doing that behind the scenes. What about some general things related to testing? I've seen some things on social media that have been floating around suggesting that PCR is not good for testing, or that it's getting confused with flu. And I'm not sure where that's coming from, because that's not really the case. PCR is very good. We basically try to find the needle in the haystack of a nose swab, and that needle is the spike protein on the surface of this virus. It's really a good test. There are a couple of different names that it goes by. PCR is the most common. We also sometimes call them NATs, nucleic acid amplification tests. That's just being nerds about it, but that's the gold standard. Rapid antigens, which are sometimes easier to get, they certainly give you an answer faster. They're really not that great, and they're really not recommended for asymptomatic screening. So we used to do this before football games or tournaments or camps, and people have really just said, you know what, it's not worth it, because too often they're positive and they're not real. And then at-home testing has become a thing. They're a little expensive. They're not as good as a gold standard PCR that you would get at an urgent care clinic or at your doctor. If they're negative and you're still having symptoms, you need to get that test. But if you're traveling somewhere and you just need to know, it's not bad. It's just not as good as it could be. All right, let's talk about boosters for a second. The longevity of previously recovered COVID-19 patients, their immunity, I've mentioned this, they're not all created equally. And the more severe you are with your initial illness, the more and better antibody that you're going to have. And we really don't know how long those individuals are going to be protected. I will tell you that immunologically, we've learned that the best combination, but the one we don't suggest, is to have severe infection, but don't die and don't have bad complications from it, followed by booster immunization several months later. The problem is we don't know who's going to have a bad infection. I'll tell you that I am now, a year and a half out. I've never used an inhaler before, except very rarely. And I'm having to now use an inhaler because of that initial infection and the scarring that happened in my lungs. Still haven't fully recovered from that. I had about 6 or 8 weeks of real brain fog is a reasonable way to say it, but just not finding the right words and not being able to communicate effectively and misremembering things. And that was unsettling, to say the least. There are a number of people who are developing long COVID symptoms and have a lot of changes that happen afterwards. And then there are those who don't survive, like my wife's grandpa, who was 104. So I think we need to be thoughtful about the fact that natural infection does indeed induce immunity, but that may not be a gamble that most of us are willing to take. And that actually includes our children too. Let me show you a couple of slides that show you some data. These are data from the New England Journal of Medicine that looks at vaccine effectiveness over time. And what I think I want you to see is that these mRNA vaccines can generate a really robust immune response that protects against all cases of disease for at least 3 or 4 months. If you look at the months after second dose, you'll see that you start to see a little bit of activity, 36% or so after that first dose, and who don't have a second dose. But once you get that second dose in the real world, you're at like 80% protected. But that goes down over time for all cases. Those are sniffles, runny nose. If you look at protection against severe disease, you can follow these folks to 5, 6, 7 months out, and you're still seeing very high levels of protection against severe disease. And that really starts to show up even by 2 weeks in people who don't even get a second dose. So I think what we can say then is that in decreasing order of immunologic robustness, infected and then vaccinated, you've got probably 95% protection after 6 months. If you're vaccinated and then you get that third booster, we don't know exactly, but it looks like it's going to be upwards of about 90%. Sorry for the typo there. If we look at those that are just vaccinated, after about 6 months, you're still looking at 60 to 75% protection overall, 90% plus for severe disease. But if you look at those who just have mild or asymptomatic infection and no vaccine, we start to get to about 20 to 50% protection by the time you're about 2 or 3 months out from the infection. So again, there are a lot of nuance to this. Hopefully some of your questions, I can go into this a little bit further, but in an ideal situation, even those who are infected should get vaccinated, and those who are vaccinated and in high-risk groups should get boosted. Now, what about safety? This is obviously one of the most important things that we want to make sure of. There are 3 that I want to highlight in this section, and we can take questions about others. Myocarditis is the first one. This is inflammation of the myocardium, or the muscle of the heart. We see this in COVID a lot. And in fact, I still think in the back of my head, did I have a mild case of myocarditis back when I was sick? I don't think I did, but I talk with my cardiology friends about it some. There was a study done in Big Ten athletes, and we probably should insert a joke here about how Big Ten athletes aren't SEC athletes, but nevertheless, the data looked pretty good at Vanderbilt for this too, which you might argue that Vanderbilt shouldn't be in the SEC. I'm in the weeds. Let me stop. All right. So Big Ten athletes, they took everybody who had COVID and they did testing of their heart to see if they had myocarditis. 2%, so 2 out of every 100 had myocarditis after COVID. When we look at myocarditis after vaccination, it's almost always boys. It's almost always after the second dose. It's almost always in those that are about 12 to 30, 35 years of age. And it's happening about 1 in every 15,000. It gets better on its own, it appears, and it does not appear to have long-term side effects. Now, we saw this with only one other vaccine. We saw it with smallpox vaccine in our military personnel after 9/11. Those who had never seen smallpox vaccine, some of them developed myocarditis. So we know that it's more common with COVID, maybe by 100 to 1,000 times than with the vaccine, but we're watching this very carefully. I will tell you that as a father, my son, who's 18, he got infected with us. He got his first dose of vaccine back in April or so of the summer. He was planning to go to camp. We didn't give him his second dose right away. We waited on it, and then he got his second dose after camp. Why? Well, because I know that even if you have mild disease, once you get that first vaccine, you're going to get a really good immune response. And I knew that would cover him through camp. But then I wanted him to have a compliant schedule. And so we got that second dose just a few months later. Turns out that's going to be better immunologically. And I don't think he had a long period of risk. So there may be some of you who want to have a conversation with your pediatrician to say, I know it's unorthodox. They may not want to do it, but you could at least have a conversation about, my kid is low risk. They're not going to camps. They're not on a sports team. They don't have any medical problems. Could we delay that second dose by a few weeks? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, in a perfect world, we could delay it for a few weeks because it would probably lead to longer lasting immunity. All right, what about blood clots? Blood clots we're seeing in a completely different group. It's not the mRNA vaccines, but the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's not in boys, it's in girls, and it's still in young women of childbearing age. It's way more common with COVID. Every single patient that gets admitted with COVID goes on blood thinners because we know that clots are a dime a dozen. They do rarely occur, probably on the order of about 1 in 500,000 or so in those who are getting vaccinated. And then what about long COVID? Can the vaccine cause long COVID? In fact, no, it's the opposite. Those who have had long COVID often describe that their symptoms abruptly improve after they get even that first dose of vaccine. All right, what about boosters? We're now recommending these for everybody over 65 and for those who are over 18 and have either underlying medical conditions or a high risk of exposure. And there's some talk about moving that down to 40 because we're starting to see folks like me in their late 40s who are going into the hospital. Boosters are now recommended for those who are either 2 months out from Johnson & Johnson or 6 months out from the mRNA vaccine. Our immune system loves it when we give a 1-2 punch like that. When we give a dose of a vaccine and then we wait and come back 6 months later, it's almost if our immune system is saying, oh, you really do want me to remember this. Okay, I'll now tuck even better antibodies away in my bone marrow so they can get recalled into action the next time we see the virus. So we're meeting, the FDA's meeting and the CDC advisors are meeting frequently this month to kind of hone that a little bit further. And again, these boosters are to the original strain that came out of Wuhan, not to any of the new circulating strains just yet. All right, last thing before we move into your questions. The data for both Pfizer and for Moderna are incredibly encouraging. They have favorable side effect profiles, very good immune responses. The doses are going to be lower. And this is why it's taken us a while to get these into kids. We really wanted to make sure that we did due diligence to make sure that these vaccines were as well tolerated in kids as they are in adults. What we learned very early on is that they make such a good immune response, we don't need nearly as much of the vaccine. So adolescents over 12 can be vaccinated now. Children 5 to 11 years of age will probably be ready in the next week to 10 days. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to say thank you for letting me do that 25 minutes or so of just level setting of saying, here's where I think we are. Here are maybe some generic answers to your questions. And then now maybe we can just take some of your more specific questions that are important to you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Creech. That was very interesting. I was paying close attention to that, particularly the part where Vanderbilt shouldn't be in the SEC. So with that, yeah, in the promotion of this event, we had an email address where families could email in questions.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we've been able to gather those, and so we'll try to work through, as time permits, as many of those questions as we can work through. But just based off of what you said right there at the end, this really kind of ties straight into it. So here's question one. Assuming the Pfizer vaccine becomes available for use in children ages 5 to 11 sometime early November, what would your recommendation be for a child turning 12 in December? They're right there on that cusp. Should these children be vaccinated as soon as one is available, even if that means receiving the lower dose that you were just talking about? Or should these children wait several weeks until they turn 12 and are eligible to receive the higher dosage?
Yeah, that's a really sophisticated question. Some of it would depend, I think, on whether the child is high risk for COVID or its complications, right? If you told me the child had a heart condition or muscular dystrophy or a seizure disorder or something like that, well, that becomes an easier decision, right? You get the vaccine just as soon as it's available and you have a chance to talk with your pediatrician about it, and you would get the smaller dose, and then you would come back in a month or so and get that higher dose now that they're 12. I think that's what I would do. And here's why I would say that. We know in the clinical trials that we've even been a part of that the lower dose that's going to be granted for the 5 to 11-year-olds is still really good at developing an immune response. And when you come back a month or 6 weeks later, you hit it again with that bigger dose, there's going to be an incredible immune response there. So I would not worry that you're cheating by getting a smaller dose for that 5 to 11-year group. I think kids respond well to this in general. With that being said, if you had a child that was super low risk and for whatever reason you just can't get in, it's certainly not going to hurt them to be 12 years and a day and get that slightly higher dose either. So it's really whatever makes sense for your family. And just recognize that the recommendation will be for 3 weeks of an interval. Recognize that there is no outer limit of that. You don't want to get it sooner than 3 weeks, but it could be 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. So what that means is maybe your child doesn't turn 12 until January, right? Well, should you get 2 doses that are of the smaller amount, or should you wait until January to get that second dose and it be a little bit higher? I would be okay with waiting. So there's a lot of nuance there, and you should try to talk with your pediatrician to see what makes the most sense for your kid based on their medical history.
As I was reading that was a good question. What is your response to people who are concerned about COVID vaccine safety and reports about adverse events from the VAERS system?
Yeah, I think this is important. And you mentioned in your very kind introduction that I help lead a clinical immunization safety assessment network. I'll try not to be long-winded about this, but I think it's important to know what our vaccine safety nets are in this country. We have 3. One is this clinical immunization safety network where individual pediatricians, family docs, they call us and they say, I had this weird side effect from a vaccine. Could you look into it? And we evaluate those cases with a national group of experts through the CDC. And I'm on a call every single day of the week, Saturdays and Sundays included, where we're looking into those very personalized vaccine side effects that people are reporting. The second one, the Kaiser Permanentes of the world and the Marshfield Clinic and all these big managed care organizations throughout the country, we have ways that we mine their medical records 24/7. And we set up studies where we say, okay, let's take everybody who was vaccinated on a Tuesday and let's look at their medical record for 4 weeks and let's see how many of them developed any other kind of medical issue that brought them back in for services. And then we see if there's any kind of a signal. That's called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. And then the third big one that we have is the VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This is where you, me, or my Uncle Joe could put into a database a side effect that I or someone I know had. Now, you can imagine if everybody has access to it, there's some strange things that get put in there. Maybe more than one person puts the same thing in there because the pharmacist puts it in there and the pediatrician puts it in there and the parent puts it in there. Well, there's a whole team at CDC that we work with that evaluates those. Does it work? It really does. Back in the late 90s, we had this super rare condition in kids where when they got a rotavirus vaccine, their intestines kind of squeezed on top of each other and it caused the blood supply to get trapped. And that was potentially fatal in some kids. And we pulled a vaccine off the market and didn't see a rotavirus vaccine for another decade and a half because of it. So not only does it work, but it has teeth when we find a signal. We've been mining that to look for some of the things that have given people pause: myocarditis, blood clots. We've looked at it for things like death. We've looked at it for abnormal menstrual cycles. Some of the others that are popping up, ear ringing, that some people are describing after vaccines. And the signals that we've seen so far that are real are the heart inflammation that we see, anaphylaxis or an allergic reaction after vaccine, and blood clots. Those are the 3. But that work is ongoing. I would also say this, these vaccines came into the licensure process very quickly, but we've been working on them for 25 years. I mean, the first viral vector vaccine I worked on was a malaria vaccine back in 2005 that's made exactly the same way as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And we've known about spike protein for 25 years. We've been working on mRNA for 25 years. And quite frankly, our previous administration, the Trump administration, deserves a lot of credit for pouring a truckload of federal resources into COVID. It's all we've done. And the Biden administration has continued that effort, where all of us who work normally on flu or staph infections or something else, all we do is eat, sleep, and drink COVID all day long. And because of that, we were able to accelerate how fast we did these things. That's why it was called Operation Warp Speed, is because our task was to develop these without making shortcuts just as quickly as we could. And the only reason we did it is we put everything else to the side. So as a pediatrician, but maybe more importantly, as a father, I have a lot of confidence in the clinical trials that have been done here. They are being more scrutinized than any other clinical trial I've ever done. It's pretty awesome from that standpoint.
That's good information. Here's another question. For children who have already had wild type COVID, is your recommendation that they only receive one dose of mRNA vaccine?
Boy, I'm torn on this. And so, I mean, it's just you and me on the screen. So as long as you don't tell anybody, Jeff, no, I'm just kidding. I know there are people watching. You know, what we know from some good colleagues, Florian Kramer up at NYU is one of them. We know that at least pre-Delta, immunologically, one dose was probably good enough. All right, here's true confessions time. When I went to get my Pfizer vaccine, which is what Vanderbilt was offering, I felt terrible. Like I went to the man ICU, and what that should mean is that I really wasn't that sick, but I felt really sick, and my wife made fun of me. I just have a weaker constitution than her, but I had fever, I had chills. I was like, there's no way I'm getting this again in 3 weeks. I also had the benefit of measuring my own antibodies, and I had, I had a truckload of antibodies after that one dose. We know that one dose likely is sufficient for a lot of people who have had natural disease. The problem is Delta messed everything up because we need more antibodies to protect us against Delta. So because of that, I got my second dose about 3 months later in March, April, because I knew I needed to be compliant with our hospital policies. But that duration, I think, helped me immunologically. So what I would say, if I were a practicing pediatrician in the office setting, I would make sure that those kids who I knew had COVID, I would give them one dose, and then I would wait probably 6 to 8 weeks, maybe 12 weeks before giving that second dose, because I don't think I'm putting them at risk. Now, here's a caveat. If there's a kid who maybe had very mild COVID, but lives in a family where there's somebody who got a bone marrow transplant or a grandmother who's 80, I don't want to take that risk because that kid can bring home COVID and spread it just as easily. It's been a little bit of a misnomer that kids aren't affected by this virus. They, in fact, are. We just haven't been sophisticated enough to see it. But there are new data from Tina Hartert, who's a Vanderbilt investigator, that shows, in fact, that they do get it. They do spread it. They just don't get as sick from it, which is a good thing. So if that household had risky people in it, I'd probably vaccinate a little quicker just to get that kid really vaccinated up.
Makes sense. What can you tell us about the safety and efficacy data in the initial studies of younger children?
Yeah, so in teenagers, it looked exactly like it does in adults. It's fever, chills, fatigue, achiness that lasts for about 12 hours, and it's usually the day after vaccination. All right, that's teenagers. That one's easy enough. The FDA has seen that, and they've approved it for Pfizer. They're reviewing it a little bit differently for Moderna because there's already Pfizer available, and there doesn't necessarily need to be a second mRNA vaccine made available just yet. All right. For the 5 to 11-year-olds, we have seen the Pfizer data because we just received the FDA briefing packet, and those data look good as well with a lower dose. So it's fever, chills, achiness, arm pain with that reduced dose. What I'm most familiar with are the 6 to 11-year group in the Moderna study, where we used a slightly lower dose. We used a half dose of the vaccine. And what we saw was, again, the same side effect profile that we see in adults. And here's a chance for me to maybe highlight a little bit about how we think about vaccine side effects, because I think this might be helpful for folks. We think about them in 3 stages. The first one are the ones that happen in the first 30 minutes where people have an allergic reaction. Those are super rare. Those are 1 in a million lightning strike type things. Number 2 are the first week after vaccination, maybe the first couple of weeks. And this is when your innate immune response, the one that's just bringing a sledgehammer to the party. And it's just doesn't know what it's doing, but it's going to make a lot of noise, right? That's when you get fever and chills and achiness and all of that. That's also when we see this heart valve or heart muscle inflammation with myocarditis. Again, very rare, but that's the next stage when we see side effects. Most commonly, it's like a flu-like illness. All right, the third time period is 2 to 6 weeks. And that's when the more refined part of our immune system is coming online. and it starts to go sideways extraordinarily rarely, like less than a lightning strike kind of rare, where we see Bell's palsy, where part of the face gets paralyzed, or we see this paralysis called Guillain-Barré that we sometimes see with flu vaccine. These are hard to predict when they're going to happen. We almost never see them in clinical trials because they're so rare. And there's very high likelihood that it would have happened with the infection as well. It just so happened that it happened with vaccine. The reason I bring those up is because if you've made it to about 6 weeks post-vaccination and there's been no side effect that has started, it is exceedingly rare. In fact, almost unheard of that a side effect is going to occur somewhere months or years down the road. That's just not how vaccines work. They are present temporarily. You make an immune response and you're either allergic to the thing or you feel bad from the thing because your immune system took a sledgehammer to it, or your immune system went sideways as it was making the immune response, but that's it. There's not stuff where it accumulates years down the road, or all of a sudden 10 years from now you have inflammatory bowel disease and it's somehow related to the vaccine. We just don't see that. We've not seen that with any other vaccines, so we certainly wouldn't expect it with the COVID vaccine.
That's good perspective there, because I don't know that question's on there, but that is something I've heard about, worried about what's going to happen 10 years from now with this, and will it affect my DNA and things of that nature.
Well, now that one's even different, Jeff. Yeah, that's a great point. You know, one of the things that that we don't do a good job of because we're nerds and we don't talk so well sometimes is that we don't really talk enough about how for these mRNA vaccines, the mRNA is just the recipe, right? It gets into the outside part of the cell, the nucleus is in the middle where all your DNA is. And the mRNA can't get into the nucleus of that cell. It's a one-way street out. So normally your DNA would make mRNA that goes out. So it can't go the other way. That mRNA is made into proteins that then get sent out from the cell, and little neighboring immune cells see it and they make an immune response to it. Two things that are really important. Number one, it physically never comes into contact with any structure where your DNA is. So it can't interfere with your DNA. That's number one. Number two is it's very transiently or temporarily expressed in the body. Same way with that lipid nanoparticle that surrounds it, the little fat bubble. People have talked a lot about, well, maybe that accumulates in the ovaries, or maybe it accumulates in other parts of the body, and it simply doesn't. Early on, those studies were done to look at the dispersal, and like less than 1% of it goes to the liver, and everything goes to the liver. So that gives us a lot of confidence that this isn't just getting deposited in the body, but getting chewed up. Second thing is that we do these developmental and reproductive toxicity tests called DART studies, where we give, I mean, there's a different maybe ethical issue here, but we do it in the most ethical way possible. But we take animals, small animals, rabbits, mice, rats, other small animals, and we give them overwhelmingly large doses of these vaccines in order to see if we change their reproductive capability or we affect pregnancies. And we didn't see anything unusual in these small animal studies that were done. That's part of getting it EUA approved and then getting it fully licensed.
Good. Here's one that's very specific. Our 5-year-old granddaughter attends Kingsport City Schools, and she has cerebral palsy. So my question is, what are your recommendations on her taking the vaccine? How safe is it for her and the other children in our home that are ages 6 and 10?
That's a great question. And, you know, every family is different, so I certainly want to be careful. But, you know, one of the things I would make mention of is that one of the things we did in the clinical trials, which I really appreciate being required to do this by the NIH, is we had to make sure that not only were our patient populations very diverse from a demographic standpoint, right? Oftentimes it's white individuals that participate in clinical trials. We made sure that there were Hispanic individuals and Black Americans that were in the studies. Second thing, we had to make sure that there were children with underlying medical conditions that were enrolled in the studies, so that we could look at those children with diabetes or heart disease or cerebral palsy, seizure disorders, and say it's safe for them too. So in that situation, not knowing anything else, I would encourage vaccination of everyone, because again, what you're trying to do is protect not only the child, but you're trying to protect those around them. And for COVID-19, maybe it's the reverse. We're trying to protect our grandparents most, our aunts and uncles and our parents, and then our kids. I don't want to minimize how much disease kids get, but I also don't want to maximize it either, right? There are a lot of children, especially preschool children, who may never receive vaccine because they may not need it. So I don't want to come in hot saying every person in the United States needs this vaccine. I don't know that that's true. What I do know is we need one available to everyone. What I do know is that those who have any high risk exposures or who are going to expose those who are at high risk, boy, those people need vaccine.
Here's one. And you've touched on this just a little bit, but I'm going to, can you say a little bit more about the concerns about fertility?
Yeah. So the biggest thing we point to are DART studies that were done as part of the FDA licensure process and approval process. Those give me a lot of encouragement as a vaccinologist and as an immunologist. Number two is our experience with pregnant women. We have had far too many women in our adult ICU who come in, they're placed on oxygen, and because they're at high risk for COVID complications, they get intubated, they're on a ventilator, sometimes they go on a cardiac bypass, and when they wake up no longer pregnant because their baby has died in utero. We've had that experience far too many times in the past 4 or 5 months. What we know is in the clinical studies, we had a number of individuals who, despite us asking them not to become pregnant during the initial parts of the study, they did. Some of them got pregnant between the first and second doses of vaccine, or maybe right after the second dose. If anything is going to be a high risk period, it's that window, right? It's that window where the baby is at its most vulnerable state, and then we hit it with a vaccine that is pretty inflammatory, right? It's making fever and chills and achiness. And what we saw is that those pregnancies did very well. There was no loss of those pregnancies. There were no birth defects in those babies. And so that gave us a lot of confidence that even vaccinating women who didn't know they were pregnant or about to become pregnant was still very safe to do. The second thing we know is that when we do vaccine studies in pregnant women in general, when we vaccinate, we usually do it in the second or third trimester, which is when all the organs have formed. And so it's really not going to be able to cause a birth defect at that stage. What we'd be worried about is somehow inducing premature labor. And we haven't seen premature labor in these individuals. Last thing is for our teenagers who aren't anywhere close to becoming pregnant, don't want to be pregnant. And the question is, are there long-term fertility issues? Well, number one, I would say, as best we can tell, COVID doesn't frequently cause any sort of infertility issues. We don't know of that. There are some preliminary reports suggesting that sperm counts in men may be affected shortly after disease. And we know that after COVID in particular, for those who get sick, menstrual cycles can get kind of wonky for a couple of 3 cycles. We are seeing, at least in a few women after vaccination, those who have a lot of fever and chills and achiness, they may have an abnormal period or 2 afterwards. But what we do not see is any indication that ovarian function is affected or fertility is affected. And certainly there's no other vaccine that's ever been associated with infertility. So I think all of that points to the fact that the data would suggest that there is no concern, and yet we continue to look for signals that would be of concern.
So I've seen this question asked 2 or 3 different ways. So I'm just going to take this one and know that it's going to knock off 2 or 3 questions.
Okay.
But knowing that, and I think you've talked about this a little bit, but knowing that kids aren't highly affected in this, is what are the pros and cons of the risks or benefits of doing the vaccine, knowing that kids aren't highly affected?
Yeah, I think this, as a pediatrician, this is one of the most challenging questions. And I have to admit, I don't know how I would vote as an advisor to the FDA or the CDC. Here's what I know. I know that teenagers often have very similar disease to adults. And when I was taking care of kids in the hospital last, we had about 12 to 15 kids in our ICU being cared for, many of whom were overweight or had other medical conditions, who were just as sick as any other adult, including one that was on cardiac bypass that is a sight to see and is very devastating. The second thing I would say is we have lost more children due to COVID than we have to influenza in a typical year. And in fact, if you take the last 5 years of flu, that's still less than the number of kids that we've lost during this pandemic. So it's not to be trifled with in kids. But I will say, and I think we'd be silly not to admit it, that kids have been less affected. They're more likely to be asymptomatic. It probably has to do with those receptors, those blue proteins I showed you that are differentially placed in kids. And there, quite frankly, aren't as many of them, we don't think, in the lining of the lungs and the nose in those younger kids. But they're still developing this multi-system inflammatory syndrome that causes them to need very specialized medicines, can damage their heart. They're still developing myocarditis. Those with underlying medical conditions are still having a rough go and sometimes dying. And they're certainly experiencing long COVID symptoms. Not only that, but we know that they can transmit it to other high-risk individuals. So while I would never vote to make children have to wear on their shoulders the burden of protecting adults, I do think those who are at risk for severe disease or who are in homes where there's a high likelihood of exposure or disease, those are going to be the kids that benefit the most. There may be some kids who, as a pediatrician, I would give one dose to, wait a few months and give the second dose to, because I think their risk is overall low. And in fact, we'll be studying that hopefully very soon, is to do alternative schedules for these kids so that we can space out their vaccine a little bit. And I think that will make them feel better after each shot. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but I think it's complicated. And I think if you're a parent thinking about how to do this, I think these parents are asking the right question. And this is a chance to talk to your pediatrician and maybe come up with a different approach. Maybe that means, waiting a little bit for that second dose. But I do think we're at a stage in the pandemic where kids were affected more with Delta than with other strains. I don't want to find ourselves behind the 8 ball, not able to protect our kids in that way.
Gotcha. There has been some pushback from some people regarding the use of vaccines with only emergency use authorization, but there hasn't been much discussion regarding treatments like monoclonal antibodies.
Yeah.
Do you know why that is?
Yeah, this is weird. So the only difference between an EUA and the biologics license, there's probably 3. Number one, the BLA requires at least 6 months of follow-up safety data, whereas the EUA we determined only needed 2 months. And that's how we were able to get things very, very quickly into the arms. That's number one. Number two, but I already told you that side effects begin in the first 6 to 8 weeks after vaccine. So if you haven't seen anything by 2 months, you're not going to see anything at 6 months that's related to vaccine. Number two, there were additional inspections of the manufacturing plants just to make sure everything was up to snuff going into the BLA. That happened under EUA, but it's a little differently done for BLA. Third difference, Pfizer can now advertise to you on television. That's the other big difference between a license with a label and then the emergency use. So I have the other big concern, and I think this is a real concern, and there was something in the Tennessean about it this week, where the compensation for vaccine injuries is slightly different, whether it's licensed or whether it's under emergency use. It's just a little easier to be able to get reimbursement for a true vaccine injury. So like if the vaccine, were to go up in the shoulder joint instead of in the arm, it's a little easier to get compensation through the vaccine injury plan once it's licensed. But beyond that, there's not a huge difference between the BLA and the EUA process. I think that's an important piece to know.
I know that we're coming up on the 8 o'clock hour and have a few more questions. How much time do we have left? Did you have time for a few more questions?
You give me your questions. I will stay as long as you need me to.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, let me try to get some of these questions rolling through here.
And I'll be less wordy.
What would you expect the impact on the school community to be once children are given the vaccine? What outcomes would you expect?
Yeah, I think it's going to lead to decreased likelihood of infections, therefore less respiratory disease, therefore less days home. I think it's going to be a lot easier to figure out if someone is sick, because in those 3 months after vaccination, even Delta is very, very rare. And so I think it's going to be the easiest thing we can do to prevent outbreaks in our schools. And it may allow us, if we've got a large number of individuals vaccinated, it can get us a whole lot quicker to discarding some of these things that we all hate, like distancing and masking and all that kind of stuff.
This one probably ties together too. So as we approach flu season, what would you predict for the winter months regarding health, and what can we expect with flu and COVID?
We have no idea. We have no freaking clue, because flu went away last year, and it went away in the Southern Hemisphere too. And it was just gone, probably because we were all staying at home and not doing things that we like. And it was just all a mess. But it worked. Something happened. So I think all of us are prepared for the worst. I think all of us are really wanting to make sure that we're vaccinated against flu. That'll at least take one respiratory virus off the table in terms of things that we can get that look like COVID. But we don't know if it's going to be a good year or a bad year. We had RSV, this respiratory virus, in the summertime, which we never see in the summer. So that was super weird. We don't know if it's going to come back this fall and winter. So the right answer is we don't have a clue, and we wish we did.
So I know the one that we're looking at possibly getting approved here in the next little bit would be Pfizer, right?
That's right.
So let's make an assumption that Moderna comes on or whatever. And I know that there's some studies that the long-term effects, there's a little bit more impact. Is there a particular, shot or COVID vaccine that you would promote over another?
There's really not, and the reason is there were just data submitted to shown to the FDA and to the CDC that some colleagues of ours participated in, where they basically said, okay, let's figure out, you got one vaccine, doesn't matter which one it was, we're going to give you a booster with one of the other vaccines, doesn't matter which one it is, we're just going to mix up all the regimens. And it turns out whether you start with Pfizer and boost with J&J, or you start with J&J and you boost with Moderna, whatever combination you give, they all work. Maybe some work a little better than others in terms of the numbers, but they all work. And so from my standpoint, I like the side effect profile of the mRNA vaccines a bit better than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the viral vector vaccines, only because they're the ones that I've studied the most. But I have no preference on any of them. I think the shot that works the best is the one that you get in your arm.
Touche. Do you have recommendations for school systems for people like me? What mitigation measures can schools use to keep our children healthy any day of the year as we move forward? Kind of talking about flu, all this other stuff that we normally can try to take care of, but adding this to the mix.
I don't envy what you are doing, because no matter what you're doing, somebody's going to say it's wrong. If you don't mask, somebody's going to say that's wrong. If you do mask, somebody's going to say it's wrong. And so you're in an unenviable position, but thank you for what you're doing. I'll tell you this, when disease, I help our church out a lot. I'm an elder at our Presbyterian church here in Nashville, Covenant Pres. And we think a lot about how are we going to keep our multi-generational congregation together, right? Our goal is to be able to be together on Sunday mornings. So when disease is rampant, boy, we mask up and we space our pews a little bit, and we don't have Sunday school. And I'll tell you, disease rates are going way down, and we're starting Sunday school back up next week. And masks are a more optional kind of thing, and less people are worshiping at home. So I think you've got to be nimble enough to say, look, disease rates are climbing. All we're trying to do is these little patchwork things, each of which do their own little bit. Vaccines do a lot, but like mask wearing helps a little bit. Distancing helps a little bit. Staying home when you're sick helps a lot. It's this, people have called it a Swiss cheese model, where if you look at a block of Swiss cheese, not all the holes go all the way through, but there are holes scattered throughout. What we're trying to do is make sure those holes don't line up. So we mask and we distance and we vaccinate and we stay home when we're sick, and all of those work together. All right. I think we need to be honest enough with each other to say, when disease rates are low, let's not be so fussy. And when disease rates are high, let's do all we can to look out for each other. And I think if that's our mindset, we may find our way a little bit more easily.
Very good. Very good. Well, I know that you stretched over the time here with us just a little bit.
About that.
I'm just incredibly grateful for you making the time to talk to our school community. I know that, and I appreciate the families taking advantage of the opportunity to ask somebody like you these types of questions that I'm certainly not, yeah, I have a doctor beside my name, but I don't have that kind of doctor beside my name. And so to be able to forward that kind of question to somebody with your background, and really at the ground level of where the research and everything is going on, is there anything that you feel compelled to share with our school community at this time as we wrap up?
Well, first I'll say thank you, and you've been incredibly gracious, and I'm grateful to get to do this. I would say that for anyone who has questions, please know that your pediatrician or your family doc, that's really the best place to go to try to get some of these questions answered. I think it's a really important thing that we're able to have these kinds of discussions. It's really rare that we can have long discussions about things. And I think it's really important. So it's good to have questions. It's good to think through this process. And it's good to have people you trust that you can go to. So avail yourselves of that. I appreciate all that you're doing up in the Kingsport area.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we were talking a little bit before we got kicked off, doing this kind of family engagement event and doing it in this manner. This might be the first of a couple different series. I mean, this has been really neat to be able to take information from our families and to be able to ask it to an expert, and to think about other ways that we can engage a community like this. So thank you for being the inaugural virtual family engagement event and handling these questions for our families so that they can be informed about events that are going to be coming up soon. It sounds like they'll have decisions to make here relatively quickly. So again, thank you. I want to say thank you to all of our families that took part in tonight's event. And as always, roll Tribe. Thank you, Dr. Creech.